Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Accountancy Europe's event today on how to reinforce SMEs' cyber resilience. This event will be held 100% online, as is appropriate with the theme. And I would already like to thank all of our viewers on YouTube for being with us today. Just a couple of practical points first from my side. Even though we are all online today, we do still encourage and we even depend on our interaction with you, our audience. So to ensure this interaction, we invite you to submit your comments and questions via Slido, and you can find the link to the Slido in the YouTube video page. The moderator, my colleague Paul Gisby, will then present your questions and comments to the panelists in the course of the discussion. But now let's get down to business. So as many of you know, Accountancy Europe represents 1 million accountants, auditors, and advisors from 35 European countries, grouped into 50 national institutes. In fact, the majority of our membership consists of SME accountants. They are most often working in SME-sized small practices themselves. Each of these SME accountants can work with hundreds of SMEs, which gives them a holistic view and expertise of what tends to work and what not for which types of businesses. So as reported to us by these SME accountant members of ours, many SMEs, they do face significant practical challenges in their digital transition in general. And that's especially the case when technology is not already an integral part of the SME's business model. But these digitalization challenges are for SMEs are further exacerbated when it comes specifically to building up their cyber resilience. It does take a lot of resources, such as manpower, expertise, money, and others, to properly assess the business's potential exposure to cyber threats, to identify potential weaknesses, and to plan the most effective way forward. But nonetheless, it is very important for SMEs to consider their cyber resilience, as we will hear from the European Commission and our expert panelists shortly, why it is vital for SMEs to start thinking about their cyber exposures. This is, of course, more relevant for some types of SMEs than others, as you can imagine. But I would say that even for a bricks and mortar SME, cyber threats can become very real from the moment that this business has digitalized accounting systems, digital online client lists, digitalized transactions, etc., etc. So these digitalized systems, they do bring immense benefits and efficiency gains for the business, but they also expose the SME to cyber attacks, which can sometimes be even existential for the business. And that's really why we're here today, why we're holding this webinar today. We're here to discuss some cyber reinforcement and support measures for SMEs. We're also here to learn a bit more about the impact of legislation, EU legislation such as the Network and Information Security Directive, or the NIS2 directive, and the Cyber Resilience Act, or the CRA. And we will hear a bit more about how they will impact SMEs specifically. And since we are called Accountancy Europe, we will also discuss a bit the accountant-specific role in SME cyber risk management. And before we move on with the program, I just wanted to quickly mention that last November, Accountancy Europe published a paper on SME cyber risk management. This paper is the 6th one in our SME risk management series, which has already seen papers on topics such as sustainability, insolvency and early warning, and intellectual property. Our paper on SME cyber risk management underlines that cyber incidents can have a significant impact on an SME's ability to do business. They can also cause major financial loss. And it is therefore crucial that SMEs identify and mitigate those risks in a context where our economies are increasingly digitalized. The paper points out that SMEs accountants are their trusted advisors and can play a key role in mitigating SME cyber risks. Indeed, as we know, most SMEs in Europe have an accountant, whether it's for bookkeeping, taxes, or general business advice, and they meet with them regularly. So in this way, the accountant is almost like a general practitioner of the SME. They have a holistic picture of the business, and they can identify the best tailored ways for SME to address various challenges and opportunities. So this cyber risks paper as well, we did develop thanks to the expertise of these SME accountant members of ours. So the paper explains why and how SMEs should consider and mitigate cyber risks, and how the SME's accountants can best support them. The paper also includes a practical checklist that the accountants or the SMEs themselves can use to improve the SME cyber resilience. The checklist can serve as a basis for a discussion or initial assessment of the SME cyber resilience. And accounting practices can, of course, themselves also use this tool to assess their own cyber resilience. But okay, I think that's really quite enough from me for today. It's my pleasure to pass the floor to Boriana Hristova-Ilieva, Legal Officer at European Commission's DG Connect. She will give us an overview of recent EU cyber resilience legislation and how these are relevant for SMEs. After Boriana, we leave you in the very capable hands of my colleague Paul, who will moderate the panel discussion. But on that note, Boriana, please, the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning. Thank you, Johan. And can you hear me well? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to share my screen. Just one moment. Okay. And put it in present mode. Okay. Is it on now? Can you see and hear everything?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Lovely. Okay. Well, hello, good morning to everyone. Again, it is a real pleasure to be with you and to talk to turn to SMEs or SME ambassadors. This is, as I understand, is the growing role of accountants in Europe. Thank you for Johan for presenting me. I'm Boriana Hristova-Ilieva. I'm a legal officer in the unit in DG Connect that is dealing with cybersecurity policy. And in the past 4 years, I have been working on the implementation of the currently applicable, so the old NIS directive, the whole revision of the NIS 2, and the proposal on the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, which was adopted last September. So I will give you a presentation on these two latest very important pieces of legislation. So one piece of legislation, one proposal, and then try to go through also the particularities and in respect to small, medium enterprises. The NIS 2 directive I start with because this is the first horizontal piece of legislation in cybersecurity in Europe. So it is our founding stone, our stepping stone. It is very important. Everything else is building on it and linking to it in a way. And we always like to start this our presentations with this timeline because it gives a good overview of where we are coming from and a bit where we are heading to. Like the first NIS directive proposal was in 2013. And after quite some lengthy negotiations, it saw the light of day with a political agreement and entry into force only in 2016. And then you see how many events came since then. This shows how important cybersecurity has become all of a sudden to everyone. So NIS 2, it was a necessary revision of the old directive, of the old framework, which because of the quick digitalization, it showed a lot of downsides, and there were a lot of issues that needed to be updated and fixed, modernized to be made also more future-proof. And now the NIS 2, which was formally adopted, entered into force on the 16th of January 2023. So now it is in force. But since it's a directive, member states have 21 months to transpose it into national law, meaning until October 2024. So it should become transposed and applicable in each member state as of October 2024 when transposed into national law. In parallel to this, there are several acts, implementing acts that the Commission has to deal with the same deadline, and I can explain a bit later about this, which provide more clarity on certain aspects of the directive. Why we needed to change, why we needed to update. So there were several main challenges in NIS1. One was the limited scope, as probably you know. NIS1 is covering only 7 critical sectors. At the time, this was the beginning. People were not talking about cybersecurity. Member states were not at all willing to commit. They presented this, they felt it as part of their national security, is being regulated by the EU. So that's where this reluctance came from. So we were only concentrated on 7 sectors, and also the so-called digital service providers, online marketplaces, cloud search engines, which were regulated with a more light touch regime. And member states had to identify the companies that would fall in the scope. So we had the 7 sectors, and within these sectors, it was up to the member states to define, based on the thresholds that they would come up with, which would be the so-called operators of essential services. So which companies would fall in the directive. And this we saw was suboptimal, because it led to great discrepancies across the EU, with one member state identifying almost every operator in a certain sector, whereas another one not identifying a single one for certain reasons, because of the thresholds they had come up with. And also the different requirements, security requirements that companies had to take, and the way they were supposed to report incidents, they differed significantly from one member state to another. And then supervision enforcement were not fully in line, and also very diverging or not being implemented, etc., etc. Incidents were not reported because the thresholds were very high. So there were quite a few elements that did not work well, which triggered this revision. Now, what NIS2 is about, it builds on the foundations of NIS1, because I mentioned the downsides, but of course there were many positive elements. The whole framework proved to be working well, with member states building their capabilities. We saw a big change of mentality, especially of less mature member states, which all of a sudden started thinking about cybersecurity, building their national capabilities, national authorities, strategies. Also, the work within, among the member states, the cooperation on an EU level, this was a big game changer. The way member states authorities would communicate within the cooperation group on a policy level, or the CSIRTs network on a more operational level. So this proved to work really well. And so NIS2 is based on the same 3 pillars as NIS2 is based on the same pillars as NIS1, with some additions. So in terms of member state capabilities, of course, the national strategies have more elements. There is the so-called coordinated vulnerability disclosure frameworks, where member states would have to arrange for their legal frameworks to be suited for coordinated vulnerability disclosure. They have to appoint a national CSIRT to be the coordinator between a vulnerability, a researcher and the owner. Also, crisis management frameworks, in case of large-scale incidents of crisis, there should be a clear contact point. And these crisis management frameworks would meet and coordinate on an EU level in the so-called cyclone network. So there is another network in case of a large-scale incident and crisis. So it's an incident which cannot be dealt with by one member state alone. Also the coordinated vulnerability disclosure so the vulnerabilities would be collected in the so-called European Vulnerability Database, which would be managed by ENISA, the cybersecurity agency. And then we have the central pillar, which is of the biggest interest to stakeholders, to the industry. These are the risk management reporting obligations on companies, and there NIS2 is streamlining, updating, streamlining, and trying to clarify what is in NIS1, and also adds certain elements. So what is new? There is no longer the so-called identification process. So it's not any longer up to member states to decide which companies fall in the scope, but there is a size threshold. So we consider that this is the best proxy of showing criticality. However, so that no one is offended, in an SME context, of course, it is also left to member states to, based on certain criteria, if a company is very critical, like a smaller company which is critical, should also be part of the scope. So we're talking about all companies in, again, the sectors which have been expanded, which I will show on my next slide, which are medium or larger. They would automatically be part of the scope. They would automatically have to comply with the requirements of NIS2. There are certain exceptions to this medium or large size threshold rule. For example, telecom providers, there it would be irrespective of the size, trust service providers, TLDs, DNS service providers. Then, as I said, it would be also up to the member states to make an analysis in what cases, if a company is the only provider, if it's very critical on a regional level, etc., then they would also be part of the scope. And also we make a clear link with the Critical Entities Resilience Directive. This is another piece of legislation which is looking at the physical resilience of critical entities. And it was adopted in parallel with NIS2, and we have ensured that it is in line, that the two are in line. So all companies that have been identified as critical under the Critical Entities Resilience Directive would automatically be part of the NIS2 scope. Then there would be cybersecurity risk management measures based on a risk-based approach, which was currently the case, but it would continue. And incident notifications, I will come to this in a second. Which are the sectors that NIS2 is covering? So in black, you see the currently covered sectors in NIS1. And in red is everything that the Commission proposed. And then the green is what the co-legislators, so in the so-called the trilogues between the Parliament and the European Council, the member states have added. So this time, not only was there no objection to the expanding the scope, but the co-legislator even added more and had further, they were even more ambitious than the Commission original proposal. So in energy, there are certain new types of companies that are added, new categories of operators, electricity producers, nominated market participants. I'm not going to read all of them, gas, hydrogen. Then the health sector, because of the COVID crisis, certain entities were considered especially critical. They are also added. Wastewater, you see in the digital infrastructure sector, also certain types of entities which are currently regulated, but in other pieces of legislation, for example, the European Electronic Communications Code, so telecom operators, trust service providers, they would be moved under NIS so that we have one really horizontal framework on cybersecurity. Public administration entities are also part of the scope on central and regional level, and then up to member states to add also on a local level. Space, you can see all this. The criteria on which we're based are what are existing practices in member states, because member states have sometimes gone beyond the current NIS 7 sectors and identified further critical sectors. the interlinkages, interdependencies between sectors, their digital dependencies, etc. So these are all the new sectors, and they are divided in two annexes. So highly critical as Annex 1 and critical in Annex 2. The difference is important because we have, you can see here, two regulatory regimes defining essential and important. So for the reason of proportionality, there are certain differences between the way essential and important entities are treated. And essential entities are, I will go back to my sectors slide. Essential entities are, as a rule, all large entities in Annex 1. And all the others, so medium Annex 1 entities and all Annex 2 entities would be treated as important. And the main difference is the supervision. So in terms of obligations, we have generally risk-based. So it's based on if a company makes an assessment of the risk it bears, then they have to take appropriate measures. So this is in terms of proportionality on the requirements. Otherwise, the requirements would be the same for essential and important entities. Also, for the reporting of incidents, there will be no difference. And as I said, supervision would differ because essential entities would be supervised ex ante and ex post, and important only ex post. This would ease the burden of important entities, and this is also relevant for the smaller entities in particular, because it would mean less documenting, less audits, and they would only be supervised in case there is an incident or there is some proof that something is not working well. Also, in terms of sanctions, there would be a difference, proportionality between important and essential. The fines are proportionate and different between important and essential entities, and also essential entities. There are some ultima ratio measures, for example, to impose temporary ban on managerial duties, but this is really like the last resort. Now, in terms of requirements and incident reporting, I mentioned the managerial duties. Another linked in a way to this is that we have as a new element the accountability for top management for non-compliance with cybersecurity risk management measures. So this is brought to the attention of the board. Cybersecurity is not just any operational measure, but it becomes more relevant. And there are certain, the directive defines a list of 10 minimum requirements. For example, one is supply chain security. This is also relevant for SMEs because it might be that NIS is addressed more to larger companies. However, the supply chain security measures, the due diligence that larger companies have to undertake, meaning that they have to check what their suppliers, if they also comply with these measures, this would also affect to a large extent also smaller companies. So these 10 measures that the directive is setting out are going to be, or the Commission has an empowerment to adopt an implementing act, which would specify further and provide more clarity on what they should look like. And for this, we have, as I mentioned in the very beginning, 21 months. So there is a deadline for certain operators, but there is a general empowerment for all companies. So there is the overall possibility for the Commission to adopt this for all kinds of companies and sectors. In terms of reporting obligations, there is an obligation to report all significant incidents. Again, the term significant is going to be defined or further specified in an implementing act. And we have staggered notification. So the first stage is an early warning within 24 hours, where of becoming aware. So the moment the company becomes aware of a significant incident, they have to make an early warning to their national authority or CSIRT. And then there provides only very general information that is available, including, for example, if there is a cross-border element, if there is a malicious element. Then 48 hours later, so within 72 hours from becoming aware, a bit more detailed report with certain elements elaborating, and then a final report within 1 month. These are the 3 stages, basically. And then the initial notification is triggering also the possibility to request help from the CSIRT and assistance to deal with an incident, which is also relevant for smaller companies that have fewer capabilities. Now, in terms of particular impact on SMEs, as I mentioned, there is a size threshold. So medium and larger companies are affected, smaller only in certain cases. And then the proportionality that we have been, that is a recurring element throughout the directive, the risk-based approach and the supervision enforcement rules, which I mentioned. And then specifically SMEs are mentioned explicitly on 2 occasions in the directive. One is that member states would need to address SME needs in their national strategies, and especially those SMEs that are not covered by the directive, by trying to adopt policies strengthening their cyber resilience and cyber hygiene baseline, and also provide easily guidance assistance to their specific needs. And also ENISA, who has to adopt a biannual report on the state of cybersecurity. In the EU, they would also address SMEs in this report. So this is on NIS2. And then the second piece of legislation that came a bit later, so we were quite busy, within 2 years, 2 proposals, was the Cyber Resilience Act, or is the Cyber Resilience Act, which was the Commission proposal was adopted in September 2022. Now it's in the process of being negotiated in the Council, and the Parliament is still appointing the committee that is going to deal with it. It is in a way a continuation of the supply chain idea, because we have seen that supply chain so cybersecurity is in general the cost of cybersecurity have been growing incredibly in the last years, and especially supply chains attacks which are exploiting vulnerabilities have become a larger percentage of the incidents. And to address this, since NIS is only addressing the way companies secure their operations. However, the product itself, so all the components throughout the supply chain, they are not addressed. And we see, for example, in our impact assessment, we have quoted studies which say that 57% of SMEs say that they would go out of business in the event of a cybersecurity attack. And as I said, this is often linked to some vulnerabilities, exploitation. Also, 2/3 of NIS incidents have been statistically were shown to that they're a result of a vulnerability exploitation. So this is what the CRA is going to address. It is the worldwide first type of a horizontal legislation which is dealing with addressing products with digital elements and asking manufacturers to take measures already in the design development phase and also throughout the whole life cycle, with the aim to diminish, to have lesser vulnerabilities in the product. So the holes in the cheese are the vulnerabilities, obviously, and we cannot come to a zero vulnerability, but at least minimize to the extent possible. So what is the CRA about? As I said, it's the first horizontal legislation. It imposes high-level cybersecurity requirements on manufacturers, also on the obligations on distributors, on importers. It enhances, on the other hand, the information that the users would receive, because the other side of the coin is not only that there are vulnerabilities, that the cause of incidents is that the users do not know how to configure the products that they're using. They're not, the instructions are not sufficient, and this is being also addressed by the CRA. It is built on the so-called new legislative framework. This is the established legislation which is known by businesses, also by small medium enterprises, for products. So it's usually product safety or products that are placed on the EU market. Here we're talking about cybersecurity essential requirements when the products are designed, built, and also throughout the life cycle. And the life cycle is capped under the Commission proposal at 5 years, again, for reason of proportionality. There are these particular obligations on manufacturers, and also the cybersecurity requirements, which are high-level, objective-oriented, and technology neutral. They're risk-based. They would be further specified in harmonized standards, which would follow. And the conformity assessment is also differentiated by the level of risk. So I will come back to that in the next slide. And then market surveillance and enforcement, it's carried out on a member state level. In terms of scope, where we are, we have products with digital elements, are all hardware and software products. For example, cloud is not covered because it's a service. So software as a service is not covered unless it is part of the so-called remote data processing solution. When a product cannot function with this remote data processing solution, and when this is subject to the responsibility of the manufacturer, then it would be part of, basically it would belong to the product. What is also not covered are purely non-commercial projects. This would also cover open source, as far as they're not part of a commercial activity. And then there are certain outright exclusions in specific products and sectors which already have are sufficiently mature in terms of cybersecurity requirements, like automotive, medical devices, certified aeronautical equipment, and so on. Now, the obligations on manufacturers, first, they need to carry out a risk assessment, which of the requirements fit the logic, fit their product, and then apply these. There are certain product-related requirements, vulnerability handling requirements, and then they have to have a technical information file, drop a declaration of conformity, and then place the famous CE marking on their products. Also, obligations would be to report to ENISA exploited vulnerabilities and incidents with an impact on the security of the product within 24 hours, of which the company is aware. This is a very generic list of the types of requirements. They're, as I said, high level, and quite usual. I mean, these are requirements that basically a manufacturer has to take into account and are not something, we have not invented something that does not exist and is not used. Also the vulnerability handling requirements, for example, it should not be placed on the market, the product should not be placed without known vulnerabilities, and then vulnerabilities needs to be addressed without delay, etc., etc. I'm going faster through this because I've been speaking for very long. And then, as I said, the CE marking and certain contact information and specific properties of the products needs to be to accompany the product. Now, on conformity assessment, again, there is certain there's a proportionality, a risk-based. The large category of products, around 90%, would undergo self-assessment. So it would be up to the manufacturer to self-assess. Of course, they are free to go to a third-party assessment if they find it easier, if they don't have the capabilities in-house. And there are certain which are explicitly listed in an annex, critical products divided into class 1 and class 2, which have been defined based on the functionality intended use. For example, if they're using industrial control systems or used by NIS2 essential entities, which would have to either apply a standard to prove to show conformity, or they would the class 2, so the more critical, would need to undergo a third-party assessment. And as I said, market surveillance is carried out at a national level. And also there is a new element, which is that there is a possibility to impose penalties if a manufacturer is not complying. Also, member state authorities would could require manufacturers to bring non-compliance to an end, prohibit, restrict the making available. So this is quite typical new legislative framework type of setting. Now, some specificities of SMEs. It is quite clear that SMEs would be highly impacted by the CRA because they represent 99% of the hardware manufacturers, software developers in the EU market. And we were, since this was clear from the outset when we were drafting the CRA and doing our impact assessment, we have aimed and we had a targeted outreach during the preparatory phase, proactively reaching out to SMEs, also with the help of DigiGrow, to get their feedback, also in the public consultation. And overall, SMEs are supportive of a horizontal framework. They think that it will be also beneficial for them. And they stressed the need for a risk-based proportionate approach for them compared to larger companies. So these were the main takeaways from the consultation activities. Now, in terms of costs, there would obviously be high costs for compliance. So securing product testing, third-party assessment, documentation, reporting, this is quite clear. However, there will be also important benefits for SMEs, which are the impact on competitiveness. So as users, on the one hand, as users, SMEs would benefit from a larger trust from end user, as users of digital elements, they would benefit. But they will also benefit from a larger trust from end users, and possibility to gain new customers. Also, there would be easier access to the internal market, less fragmentation, which would mean that they could handle easily the regulatory. So instead of having very very diverging rules in different sectors, they would have to deal with only one set of rules. So there will be more clarity and easier compliance. And as I said, also as users, they would be have access to more secure products themselves and be able to more confidently procure and use and be better informed when they configure and use the digital products that they use. I mentioned already this that 57% would claim bankruptcy, even according to a NISA study, in case of a serious incident. So it is very relevant for SMEs. Now, how would the CRA address the needs of SMEs? So the requirements are objective, technology neutral, risk-based. So it would depend on the type of products, and they are not meant to go beyond what is necessary to achieve this. The objective, it will be also in the hands of the manufacturer to come up with the most efficient way to achieve to reach the goal. The conformity assessment to 90% is self-assessment. Then there is a very clear, detailed explanation of how the CRA would interplay with other legislation, so that we don't, to avoid duplication of regulatory burden, for example, the interplay with the Radio Equipment Directive Delegated Act is specified, also from the AI Act, Machinery Directive, etc. And when building this, so the Commission would apply for, make a request for harmonized standards. So these standards would build on already existing national, international standards. And for this, because we understand that the standardization is one of the most crucial steps in this process to allow for the application of the CRA, the work has started. So we have already started the mapping of existing standards. So there are two streams of work. One is the mapping and then a gap analysis, to be able to already launch a request preempting the final stage of the CRA. So once the CRA comes into force, that the standards would be soon after available. Funding and guidelines is also something that the EU can provide. So the funding by Horizon Europe, Digital Europe program. So on the one hand, we have know-how and capacity, so skills capacity building, where SMEs can apply and benefit from, also on a more regional, local, regional, national level, digital innovation hubs and national cybersecurity coordination centers are there. And also the Commission is able to provide guidelines for specific questions which would benefit further clarification. And now final words on where we are. So the proposal was adopted. We are hopeful that by the EP elections, there would be an agreed final text between the three co-legislators, meaning in 1 year, May 2024. As I mentioned, standardization work has started, and then there is the so-called transitional period of 24 months, according to the proposal, from the entry into force, and 12 months for the reporting obligations, which require less adaptation for the manufacturers. So these are the next steps, and I hope I spoke quite long. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to listen to the discussion and then answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Boriana, for that excellent summary of EU initiatives in this area. As Boriana mentioned, she will be staying with us, and I understand there are already many questions stacking up. So we'll answer these after the next panel. Well, I'd like to introduce the next panel. So we've heard the legislative proposals. We'll be looking now more at the actual practical impacts on SMEs and their advisors. And I think many people and many SMEs out there regard cyber land as a bit of a jungle. So we'll be talking to three experts who we hope will be able to help us navigate through the jungle, identify the dangerous animals there, and put some protection in place from these. We'll start off with Antonio Grasso. He's the EU Policy Director for European Digital SME Alliance, and he will bring the perspective of digital SMEs to the discussion. So, Antonio, I'd ask you to briefly introduce your organisation, and could you please let us know what you hear from your members and why it's so important for SMEs to reinforce their cyber resilience. So, Antonio, over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. And first of all, let me say thank you to Accountancy Europe for the invitation and this very important discussion today. From our side, the European Digital SME Alliance is the largest network of SMEs engaged in the ICT sector in Europe. We represent more than 45,000 small and medium enterprises engaged in the digital sector. And we also represent more than 30 national and regional organizations in Europe that represent themselves digital SMEs. So we believe the legislative action that the Commission is taking both on the NIS2 and on the CRA is very much needed to level up the European cybersecurity in Europe, and we welcome a proportional approach with respect to especially the CRA requirements on SMEs. You asked me, Paul, why it is important for SMEs to reinforce their cyber resilience. Well, there is evidence that this is crucial nowadays because more and more, even the traditional SMEs across industrial ecosystems are getting their business models more and more digitalized. Our members are those that are already investing in digital solutions that are also cyber secure and can bring these solutions to the market also to enable the traditional SMEs to level up their cybersecurity standards and make sure they can indeed navigate into this jungle that you mentioned of cybersecurity risk. What we hear from our members is that indeed traditional SMEs have limited resources to deal with cybersecurity risk. This is something we need to acknowledge also when implementing European legislation. And because of their limited resources, it is very hard for traditional SMEs to recover from damages that are caused by cyber attacks than it is as compared for instance, big industry. It is very important that SMEs can respond to the damage of cyber attacks and then can prevent cyber attacks because they are 99% of the European industrial base, and we need to protect them for cyber threats. What we know from our members is that cyber threats and cyber attacks have increased incredibly since especially the onset of the COVID pandemic. And this is also evidence that is available publicly. For instance, from a World Economic Forum report that points out that there has been, since the COVID pandemic, an increase of 667% in terms of the number of attacks that have been targeting small and medium enterprises, and especially phishing attacks. These are the most common cyber incidents that SMEs experience, and effective cybersecurity requires an end-to-end commitment that covers all actors in the supply chain and that protects our SMEs from this. Boriana mentioned rightly that according to a survey conducted by the European Agency for Cybersecurity, ENISA, 50% of SMEs have considered that a cyber attack might bring an economic damage as big as forcing them to close down their business. So this is the extent of the threat, and therefore we need to have action on cyber resilience that is suitable to the needs of SMEs and that can be easily adopted for SMEs to foster this cyber resilience. Now, what is this action? What are the solutions available? Of course, the key action that the SMEs could take is to invest in a digital solution. But as we mentioned, they often lack the financial resources and even the competencies in-house in order to handle the right measures that can compensate for cyber risk. Often what they need to have is inside their company an information security manager, someone that is skilled about data protection in order to ensure that the information that they handle, even business information, is handled in a secure way. But many SMEs, as we know from our members, cannot afford to have these roles in-house within their personnel. And that is where we believe digital SMEs can play the role of enabler for them to receive affordable services to comply with cybersecurity rules and requirements that would enable to ensure the continuity of their business operation. Now, even us as an organization are trying to bring a contribution to these challenges, and this is especially when it comes to designing the guidelines and trainings that are suitable for SMEs to be uptaken. And indeed, us as an organization have done an excellent experience together with other SMEs organizations such as SBS in designing guides that are targeting cybersecurity requirements. For instance, for the implementation of the ISO standards 27001 on information security management, but also on implementing essential security controls for SMEs to protect user privacy and ensure GDPR compliance. These standards are very much needed for SMEs, and guidelines that can be suitable to their capability and needs are those tools that enable them to uptake cyber resilience measures. This is one of the things that the CRA should take into consideration over the legislative process, because it is important to have standards, but standards per se do not help SMEs get out alive of the cyber jungle. Standards need to be designed in a way that is sustainable and suitable for SMEs. And to do this, it is essential that at European level and at international level, in the standards bodies, SMEs are sufficiently represented for the design and implementation of the standards to take into account their need and to be pragmatic and practically implementable in practice. So this is in a nutshell the feeling that we get from our members, and I hope we can further discuss this in the continuation of the panel.
Thank you very much, Antonio, and of course we will have an opportunity to discuss these themes later on. So we've heard from SME businesses, and now we'll go over to some SME accountants. And we'll start off with Gert de Vlutter, partner of Schutterman Audit and Assurance, and apologies for my pronunciation. So Gert, could you please introduce your work, your role in supporting SMEs, and sort of generally address the question of what role can and should accountants play in supporting SME cyber resilience, and what makes accountants well placed to provide this sort of support to their clients? Gert, if you please.
Yes, thank you, Paul. Your pronunciation is pretty good. Yeah, my name is Gert de Vlutter, but in English maybe Gert is much more easier. I have a bit of cold, so I will drink some water. Yes, I'm a partner of Schouterman Accountants, and we are an SME accountant firm with 6 offices and 185 employees in the Netherlands. I'm responsible for the audit and assurance discipline within our firm. And we as accountant firm, we are member of SRA International in the Netherlands. We are member of INA, and INA is the International Association of Accountants. INA is located in Brussels, by the way. And I've been board member and chairman of INA in the past. Your question, Paul, is what's the role of accountants relating to cybersecurity? Yeah, what we at least experience is that we operate in a very dynamic sector nowadays. Employees are difficult to find. Burden of new standards and regulations is getting higher and higher. We have to invest in IT, etc., etc. And looking at other trends in accountancy, we see that SMEs are more demanding from accountants. They want more added value, also on IT and also on cybersecurity. And we as accountants, we want to put SMEs needs first. We have to put SMEs needs first. Also with cybersecurity, which is currently SMEs' #1 concern, as recently investigated in the Netherlands. And not only due to the new NIS2 directive, which makes management accountable, like Brianna explained, but also in our audit work, we have the requirements to investigate the information technology environment of SMEs. And for example, according to Dutch law, auditors have to report on the reliability and continuity of information technology, and also on different ISAs, for example, ISA 315, and they focus on the importance of the IT environment during the audit. And as we see it, cybersecurity is an important aspect within the IT environment of the SME. And as accountants, was another question of you. I think we have the opportunity to help SMEs on cybersecurity. We've got a relationship with the SMEs, with management. We've got the trust and also the regulatory support. However, what we see in practice is the challenge is that we, as I often stated, we are just simple accountants, and most of the times we lack the tools and talent to deliver on specialist items. So yeah, let's be honest. What do we do on IT in most cases during audit? Besides system authorities, password policy, change management, and backup recovery. And what do we really know about cybersecurity? So what do we see? More and more SME accountants have employed or hired IT auditors in their audit practice. We are doing the same. But besides that, we help SMEs with a new range of products related to cybersecurity. What we do working with SMEs, we start with a simple checklist, like the checklist of Accountancy Europe. First, to analyze the cybersecurity profile, the cyber resilience of the SME, and attention points coming out of the checklist. And we include our management letter and also our auditor's report. We suggest and advise SMEs to improve weakness points, and we can support them with that through IT partner, and amongst others, we also suggest to work with a cybersecurity monitoring dashboard like LupaSafe, which one Han will explain. And we use the findings of that dashboard in our audit, analyzing the IT environment risks, but also we include the findings in our management letter and auditor's report. And furthermore, what we added to this cybersecurity monitoring dashboard is we can add factual findings or assurance reports to this report that is generated from the dashboard. And we use this this assurance report or factual findings report to support the governance of SMEs, but also insurance companies who wants to know whether the SME is cyberproof. And I think in this way we created new sources of revenues. And what we see normally is that we bill traditionally based on hours, and this is a new model. It's annual recurring revenue. And what we also managed to do with this is digitizing our audit process, using the dashboard to analyze, investigate the IT environment. Yeah, and what we also do, and maybe Han can also explain this, in the region that we work in, we together with LupaSafe, we started a project to make SMEs in our region more cyber-proof. Together with the city council and also the society of SMEs located in the area, to give them access to the cybersecurity monitoring dashboard. So Paul, that's in a nutshell how we support SMEs on cybersecurity.
Thank you very much, Geert. And you have obviously mentioned the work that Han does. So we'll now switch over to Han Veldwijk, the CEO of LupaSafe. And again, Han, if you can introduce your work of how you help SMEs, and maybe you could comment on risk management and particularly on risk awareness. In your experience, how can we help SMEs assess their cyber vulnerabilities and their greatest risks? So over to you, Han. Very good, Paul. Quick check, can you hear me? Yes, I can. Thank you. Awesome. That's a good start, right? That's a good start. Excellent question, Paul. Let me get there in a second. So first, as you asked, I am Han Veldwijk, one of the founders of a company called LupaSafe. LupaSafe is basically monitoring companies like a criminal does, right? And then actually providing accountants with the data for risk management reporting. Bit of my background. We started off in ethical hacking at the age of 15, actually 12, long time ago. And then we pursued careers in banking and insurance. And we realized, right, for SMEs, there's no good solutions out there. That's been the background. We operate mainly in Europe. So Holland, Germany, United Kingdom, France, and Spain. Now back to your question, right, which I think is highly relevant for the audience today. So how can basically accountants help SMEs assess their cyber vulnerabilities, right, and their greatest risks? And the first thing indeed is raising the awareness. SMEs are busy with many things, right? Inflation, talent, financial management. And the thing we see is how can you actually raise awareness for cybersecurity? Not even NIS2, right? And those things, but more like basic cybersecurity hygiene. And it starts with the accountant. And you might wonder why the accountant? Think about it. Who else could the owner of a business go to, right? Notary, lawyer, maybe their IT partner. They're all like a bit too far away from the work of the business itself. And then to raise the awareness, it starts, as Geert said, with asking questions. And these can be very simple questions. We see accountants in this sense as a general practitioner, as a doctor, a family doctor who looks after the health of the company. And questions can be very simple, like, for example, hey, do you have a backup? Did you test your backup? Do you get good reports about your security posture? Do you have an overview of the risks you are managing?
these are all basic questions that accountants can ask their firms, their clients, as part of their reporting process. And we see accountancies like Scuteman doing this with great success, and they're building better relationships with their clients. So yeah, actually, I think that, Paul, is basically a good starting point, right? Asking basic questions, can be online, it can be in a session, and just to get to raise the awareness. Now, once we start with the awareness on our side, in collaboration with accountants, we see that the clients want more. And we see the accountants usually prescribing, like a doctor, a few more tests, right? It was earlier mentioned that phishing is a big risk to SME companies. Well, when was the last time the client, did a phishing test? And you'll be surprised how much the impact of a simple phishing test can have on a client firm, right? In our experience, we see one out of 3 employees sharing confidential data within the first working day on a good phishing message. And this really is increasing cyber awareness on the end of the SME company. And then you can actually basically probe further, right? Do you know what data of your firm has been breached, has been exposed to criminals? What kind of email accounts or login details? And suddenly you can see the business is starting to realize that cybersecurity is indeed one of the business risks that they should be focusing on. And in our work, we work with many accountants, and accountants, they can quantify the cost, right? We know on average, for example, in Holland, 1 out of 5 firms is hit by cyber attacks. And hearing the panel earlier, I think the numbers could be actually adjusted upwards. But 1 out of 5, according to Dutch statistics, is a victim each year. And then we also know the average downtime is like 3 weeks. So accountants can quantify this as a business risk, right? How much would it cost you in revenue if your business is down for 3 weeks? Do you have the working capital to basically handle these kind of events? Do you have controls in place? And so these are things that the accountant can do. Now, where we help it is basically quantifying the risk side itself. So the accountant can look at the cost, raise the awareness, start the questions, and we'll do the analysis on these cyber risks. And these are very pragmatic. The question we always ask is, if a criminal would be monitoring your company, what would they find, right? And when we ask this question, we're already interested in 3 things, right? One is people. How would people respond to phishing messages, to malware, to social engineering, right? Attempts to share data with someone they don't know or think they know. And then second is technology. How secure is the technology you're using? Are you using firewalls? Is there vulnerable software out there? I think we saw earlier with, I think it was Brianna, that many events happen due to exploitation of vulnerable software. These are things we're looking into continuously. And then lastly, how good are the processes, right? Is there an updated system? How do you handle vulnerabilities? How do you test vulnerabilities? Do you have instant response plan? All these kind of basic measures. And we see the accountant here is key inside that conversation in identifying those kind of gaps and opportunities. And then for us and other companies, it's up to us to provide the data. Accountants are focused on accounting. And the thing we see is this could easily be expanded to what we call cyber accounting, right? Audit a firm over the past year. How are they doing on the controls? How are they doing on training? How are they doing on maintaining their systems? And so this way you can actually quantify the continuity risk by cost and by the actual cyber risks. At the end of the day, what we see that SMEs are looking for is what we call the 3 C's, right? One is compliance. Are we compliant with the standards or regulations that apply to our type of business? Second is comfort. Can we sleep well tonight? That we've done the best we could to secure our firm. And can we prove this? That's number 3, cover. Can we prove to insurance companies, banks, stakeholders, and investors that we did the best we could do for our firm to secure it? And that basically is a quick summary of how we work together with accountants in putting clients first when it comes to cybersecurity.
Thank you very much, Han. That was an excellent indication of some of the basic work that SMEs and their accountants can undertake in order to mitigate cybersecurity risks. Johan's been acting as question master, so I'll just briefly hand over to him to pose a question that's come through the chat. Johan, do we have an interesting question for the panelists and for Boriana as well?
Yeah, Paul, thanks very much for that. We have actually quite good interaction, quite a few questions that we're seeing in Slido. I'll just ask them one by one. So, you know, I ask the one question first, and then we can see where the discussion goes. So it's sort of a general question that I guess all of the panelists could give their thoughts on. And the question is, to what extent do you think that cyber insurance can help SMEs improve their cyber resilience?
Do we have any takers for that? Does anyone?
Yes, I would love to.
Okay. Go ahead, Han.
That is an excellent question. Cyber insurance. Gert mentioned that in Central Holland, we are onboarding 1,000 companies on the platform with the government and accountants. And this question we get all the time. So actually, one of the board members of the collective professional association is actually doing an RFP with many cybersecurity insurance companies across Europe. And what we've learned is these days, you should be happy if you are granted a cybersecurity insurance. Many security, they're basically a handful of really big insurance providers, and they are retreating from the market based on the exposure risk. So this is what we see in our work in Holland and in Western Europe, that if you can get cyber insurance, you're lucky. But the big companies are retreating because the exposure and the costs are too high.
Thank you very much, Han. Do we have any other input on this?
Yeah, what I can add to that is that what we see is that more and more cyber insurance companies wants to know whether SMEs are cyber-proof, and for that they want more than only some general information. What we see is that they more and more demand a report from an independent accountant, for example, show that the SME is cyber-proof before they give the insurance.
Thank you, Gert. I think I saw Boriana itching to provide input on this point.
Yes, if I can add also some thoughts, because this is also a question I get as well often. I mean, on cyber insurance already, while we were revising this, there were even the big insurance companies coming to us and saying, you know, we want to develop this in Europe. And what Hans said is quite right, but it's not working well. And there is a big gap between what we have here and what we have across the ocean, for example, in terms of cyber insurance and culture on cyber insurance. I mean, we have to be aware of the risk that the cyber insurance can bring in terms of attracting hackers and attacks on one hand, but then the big issue, I think, or what cyber insurers have mentioned as the big issue, is the lack of data on the basis of which they can price their products. And the lack of data is often linked to the lack of incident reporting. And now NIS2, hopefully with the adapting the threshold for incident reporting, making it a bit more workable. I mean, this has been the aim. We hope we'll succeed in this. It would facilitate the reporting. It would motivate the companies to report more incidents, so that over time this might develop better. But for now, we haven't developed this yet.
Thank you, Boriana. Antonio, do you have any comments on this?
Very much in line with what was discussed, especially of what Boriana highlighted in terms of risk that you know, relying only on cyber insurance could bring. We see this risk also related to the actual capacity of SMEs to seek for external help. Before I was mentioning about the limitation in terms of financial resources that most SMEs have in Europe, and to externalize and to rely on external insurance, it will be very complicated for them. In this respect, when we talk about market analysis, when we talk about impact assessment of legislation, it is very much important to consider that in order to become cyber secure, the SMEs needs to make in-house investments that need to, for them to have the capacity and the skills internally to prevent in first place cyber risk, and also to be able to report the cyber incidents, to acknowledge the occurrences of mishandling, for instance, of data. So for very basic needs such as data protection, privacy policy, we know that from the traditional SMEs in Europe, there are challenges even when it comes to apply legislation to simple use cases in terms of having the in-house competence and skills to be able to implement this. That is why we need for expert advice and guidelines, as I was mentioning before, for those SMEs to be able to deal with these challenges in the most, in the less and least burdening way for them.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Johan, what do we have next on the list?
So let me check. We have a question here specific to the Cyber Resilience Act, the CRA, and open source. So the question is, if open source software is the basis for a bigger piece of software in a product with digital element, is that product in the scope of CRA? Boriana, I guess this might be immediately a question for you, but Antonio and Gert, of course, feel free to pitch in as well.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Actually, this is something that I was at the end rushing through the presentation. I did not clarify sufficiently about at what stage the product is covered or has to comply with the requirements under the CRA. And this is when we have a final product which is placed on the market, it has to comply. But also components which are placed on the market separately, they should also comply. And this would also apply to any software part, be it open source. Again, we're talking about non-commercial is excluded, but if it's commercial and it's separately placed, provided on the market as a component, then it would fall, then it should comply with it. So if it's just used as one part, it will be for the end, for the producer or developer of the final product that would have to comply with the requirements of the CRA.
Apologies, I made the cardinal error of not unmuting myself there. Thank you very much, Boriana. Does anyone else on the panel have any thoughts on this particular matter? If not, we'll look at another question on the list.
Yeah, sure thing. This is maybe Gert and Han, more for you. There's a question about NIS2 specifically. So what will be the expected impact on accounting firms from NIS2? So can NIS2 directly apply to the accounting firms, and if so, in which cases? And obviously, Boriana, if you have any views on this specific question as well, would be good.
Yes. Actually, it was a question from me to Boriana. So does she foresee a role for accountants with regards to NIS2? Because, of course, I think we can advise and support our SMEs in being compliant with NIS2. And of course, we can include it in our audits, because not compliant with NIS2 is a business risk. But I'm curious whether the European Commission foresees a role of accountants, compliance of SMEs with NIS2.
Boriana, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, thank you. So in NIS2, we have ICT service management, which is managed service providers, managed security service providers. but I'm not sure. I don't think if accountants as such would fall under this. It is a bit of a different animal. And then we have in the financial sector, banking and others, and then there is DORA. I don't know whether accountants don't fall under the DORA regulation. And here, I'm sorry if I'm.
Yes, yes, they do.
They do. So if they do, this means that DORA is the so-called lex specialis to NIS. But again, it would be DORA that it applies because NIS does not, to my understanding, apply directly to accountants. As such. And DORA, let me check actually. DORA mentions accountants explicitly, or is it one of the listed types of?
Yeah, do you?
Maybe you can check and
account information. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yes, it's in the scope of DORA.
Yeah.
And DORA has, probably you're aware, it has very detailed requirements on all financial operators, and this would cover also accountants. Indeed.
Yeah, and the second question, Boriana. Do you foresee a role of accountants with SMEs who have to be NIS2 compliant, that they need to audit whether they are compliant?
Well, again, as I mentioned, as a rule, so smaller companies would, as a rule, not be covered. The medium ones, which are in the scope, would, again, as a rule, there could be exceptions because member states can go beyond and also decide that a certain small company is so critical that they would have to be treated as an essential, like a large company. So in the case that a member state says this SME is critical, we need to treat it as essential, then they would undergo that they would have to undergo audit, etc., by the national authorities. As a rule, the smaller companies would only have to address the requests of national authorities if there is an incident and if something goes wrong, but they would not be subject to any regular audits.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Any further comments on this? If not, we'll move to another question.
Well, Paul, I actually also have a question for Boriana. She's popular here this morning or afternoon. Could I ask the question?
Absolutely.
So, Boriana, I think we've seen reports that NIS2 will cover around like 160,000 European enterprises, right? That's a very rough estimate, I believe, depending on the final outcomes and stuff and national legislation. Could there be any impact on supply chains? So meaning if one bigger firm is subject to NIS2 or a medium-sized, could that firm require their vendors, their clients, their suppliers to also demonstrate some level of being in control in this thing? This is one of the things I was wondering about.
Yes, I mean, indeed, this is the supply chain security is one of the very important elements of NIS2. It's not new because as part of the security measures that NIS2 is listing, these are all measures that are either already in place in the member states, either based on ISO standards or common practice. So not supply chain security is being carried out. It's just that now it is explicitly listed as one of the requirements. And it's not only for the companies, but it's also member states that have to put supply chain security in their national strategies and, have policies around this developed. In terms of what supply chain security means, so the way it's phrased in NIS is that companies that fall under NIS would have to take supply chain security measures, including security-related aspects concerning the relationships between each entity and its direct suppliers or service providers. So it is generally limited to tier 1 suppliers, but there is an encouragement to go further And indeed, it will be part of the required due diligence of companies to check their at least direct suppliers when they're procuring any product services as a NIS company falling in the scope of NIS.
Thank you very much. We don't have any further comments on this. I think we have another question from the floor, so to speak.
Yeah, indeed. So the question is, SMEs more and more use cloud software, which is not in the scope of the CRA. And if this legislation does not apply to the software as a service elements, how will NIS2 and CRA actually help SMEs to become more resilient, more cyber resilient?
I guess that's addressed at you primarily, Boriana, but obviously if anyone else has any views on this, please step in.
Shall I start?
Please.
Thanks. I mean, this is a question we get very often now in the CRA negotiations. At the same time, I probably didn't point it out clearly. So cloud is covered already now under NIS1. So it is one of the first as a digital service provider under the so-called light touch regime. It would continue to be covered under NIS2, but now it is becoming one of the critical types of services, so that cloud is among the, I don't know if you remember in the slides, there was this Annex 1, Annex 2. So Annex 1, the large cloud providers would be automatically essential entities, and then medium-sized cloud would be important, again subject to the member states' discretion to also make them as essential if considered necessary. So NIS requirements and reporting obligations which already apply to cloud would continue to apply to cloud, and the requirements would be more stringent now on cloud providers.
Thank you very much, Boriana. Does anyone else have any thoughts on this?
If I may, Paul, from our side, well, what I could say is that we are in current discussion with our members to formulate actually a position on the CRA. And indeed, this question about cloud is one that emerged about the inclusion of cloud services within the CRA requirements. What is important from our members, what we see as a need and as a request that is coming from them, is to make sure that even if cloud is included in the CRA at the end, what the CRA needs to make sure is to that there are no overlapping in terms of requirements with the existing legislative framework and other key regulatory actions that have been taken in the area of cybersecurity. We believe this is in the spirit of the CRA, so we are happy to acknowledge that. And the introduction of horizontal cybersecurity requirements is the one that could bring benefits to the SMEs, because it will enable them to confront with an homogeneous regulatory environment without fragmentary rules that could bring additional administrative burdens to the SME. And as mentioned before, the SMEs sometimes lack the awareness and the expertise to even understand how to translate the requirement in practice. There are many SMEs in many parts of Europe that have their management that is not familiar with the most advanced digital tools. We know from several reports, for instance, from Digital Europe as well, that for instance, in Hungary, 70% of SMEs owners are around 55 years old, and they are usually not familiar with the latest digital solutions. That is why we need the proportionality in terms of requirements. And another a key element that could be taken into account in the CRA, as it has been done, for instance, in the current proposal on the Artificial Intelligence Act, is the introduction of regulatory sandboxes for SMEs to be able to test their cybersecurity framework and you know, try to have the possibility to have measures that they can introduce before they are asked to comply with the requirements.
Thank you very much, Antonio. Well, we're coming towards the end now, but I'd just like to pose one final summing up question to each of the panelists, if they wish to answer this. So briefly, I'm sure many SMEs out there think, oh, I'm too small to be of notice to hackers and cyber criminals. So what as a two-stage thing, as a quick summing up, what would each one of you respond to that question? And what's one key first step that every SME should absolutely do to start on the path of cybersecurity? Do we have any willing victims for the first person for this? Is Hayat nodding?
Yeah, I'm here. Yes, yeah, a lot of SMEs think it's not happening to me, we're too small. But what we see is that hackers change their strategy. They first go for the small fishes and then use it to attack the big fishes. And also what we see is that also for SMEs, the costs can be very high. So that's also very attractive for hackers to ask for a ransom. So no, you're not too small. I think every SME is attractive for hackers. And what should be increased is, I think, first awareness that you also can be a victim. And secondly, I think one of the most important measures that you can undertake is multi-factor authentication. Because when you use multi-factor authentication, I think you can reduce your risk with a very huge part.
Thank you very much, Hayat. Anyone? Who's next? Do we have any? Antonio, I think you're unmuting.
From my side, indeed, to support also what just said, we know that SMEs and especially the smallest sometimes are not aware that they are actually handling sensitive data that also deal with their sustainability. So in order to improve this, indeed, the first step is awareness, but also for this awareness to be effective, there is a need for expert advice. How this advice can be implemented is via the standards on one side. They need to be suitable for SMEs, that cannot be costly and burdensome. And in order not to be like that, the SMEs must have a say in the standardization bodies that design such standards. Standards that are designed in a suitable manner can be helpful, because then SMEs are aware that this is out there, and they can do steps, you know, A, B, C, and D to protect their data and to ensure business continuity. On the other hand, and in light of the CRA requirements, you know, to be translated into practice, what the SMEs need is the adequate support from the legislator in terms, for instance, of action in the implementing acts of the CRA. That needs to be provided for, you know, the SMEs to have also the financial tools to level up their cybersecurity and to implement the standards in practice.
Thank you, Antonio. Help from legislators. Boriana, is there anything that you can give us in respect of that?
Well, I can only say that no one is too small, and even the smallest are the most vulnerable one, and that's where large supply chain attacks start often. So indeed, awareness is crucial, and what we think the ultimate aim of the legislation that we have been proposing or that we have been working on is to change the culture of everyone, of all stakeholders, starting from the smallest to the largest companies. Be it from the securing of their own operations through the products that they produce, the products that they procure, they buy, they use. So it is about making sure that security is taking into account at each step of the whole spectrum. So changing the culture is I think the ultimate aim, and this is awareness, of course, is important part of it.
Thank you very much, Bariana. And Han, do we have any final thoughts from you?
So yeah, if an SME company could do one thing, right, only one thing, that would be to have a working backup, right? That's a question any accountant can ask. Why? The most common attack is ransomware for SME businesses. And that means someone else is leveraging your data over your finances, right? And if you have a working backup, you at least are not like, it's not required to pay the ransom, right? You have your own future in your own hands. You can still be ransomed for like promotion of the data or leakage, but a working backup is one of the best things any business can do. And basically, if you can pay a bill, right, you can be a victim. It's as simple as that. And fact is, small firms are actually weaker. They're good targets in a market where bigger companies have high-end security. Well, you're basically the weaker prey. So have a good backup, and well, do anything else then on top of it.
Thank you very much, Han. Wise words there. If you don't want to be the easy prey in the jungle, take appropriate protection. Well, thank you very much to all the presenters for a very interesting, informative and illuminating interventions. And thank you very much all online for your kind attention. And please keep in touch with Accountancy Europe, view our website for more upcoming events in all sorts of areas, but including SMEs in particular. Thank you very much, and on behalf of Accountancy Europe, have a very good afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul and Johan.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.